living. Ain't nothing like the cost of living high.
Hello again, this is Professor Watson. Today we're going to do a little bit more macro, and today we're going to talk about money and inflation with a focus on understanding some basic economics of inflation and then inflation's effects on the economy, and in particular its effects on interest rates and asset values. Start with a basic definition. Okay. The textbook's going to tell you that inflation is defined as an increase in the general level of prices in the economy. That's a good definition. That's not wrong, but I think it's a little incomplete. I want to round out our discussion of inflation by thinking about what causes it. Okay, so what I'm going to tell you is inflation is a decline in the value of money over time, okay? And that will cause an increase in the general level of prices. Okay, but actually the price increase is more of an effect. And think through the logic here. It's pretty straightforward. Every dollar becomes less valuable. Okay, money is losing value over time. That's what inflation is. It therefore will take more dollars to buy any particular good. Okay. And the best way I have to illustrate this is just to take you on a really brief historical tour of the US dollar. Okay. And actually what I do in class is a fun activity where I'll put these different dollars up on a table. And I won't tell the students what they are. I'll just let them come and look at them. And the challenge is this. If I owed you $1, which one would you take? Okay. Invariably, more than half of the students will select the paper dollar. I always get my last laugh in when I reveal that the gold dollar that was produced from the 1830s up to the 1880s, it was in legal circulation up until the 1930s, actually has a current gold value of more than $60. So if you would have picked that gold $1 piece, you would be ahead roughly $59. The silver dollar, which existed alongside the gold dollar and actually lasted quite a bit longer in common circulation up actually until the 1960s, has a silver value in terms of current dollars of about $14. So if you pick the silver dollar, you'll still be quite a bit ahead. And finally, the paper dollar as we know it, and I'm specifically talking about the Federal Reserve note for the $1 bill, has only been around since 1963. And of course, that doesn't have any commodity value. It's made out of paper. It's only worth its face value, so you can buy $1 worth of goods with it, but that's it. In terms of thinking about inflation, notice this, and this is the main lesson I want to draw here. Starting way back here, back in the 1800s, and then going forward through time to the late 1800s up to the 1960s, and then from the 1960s until now, what's happening to the value of the dollar? It's going from 63 to 14 to 1. Okay. The value of the US dollar has declined over time. This is exactly what we mean when we talk about inflation. Okay, and this is the best, I think this is kind of the most hands-on way you can think about what inflation means. Here's the great monetary economist Milton Friedman. He's a well-known scholar on this topic, and he has this famous quote when it comes to, well, okay, what's causing inflation? Friedman says inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. What does he mean by this? Well, something is happening to the money. Money is changing, money is losing value. Therefore, as money loses value, it takes more units of money, it takes more dollars to buy any particular good. Value of money is shrinking, in other words. And you can really understand that again when you think back over time. What's happening with money? Well, we're replacing a more valuable form of money, gold or silver, with a less valuable, a cheaper form of money like paper. Okay. Let's think about it in basic supply and demand terms. Draw a familiar supply and demand graph here where we've got, now instead of good in general, you know, if we've looked at gasoline before, we've looked at milk. Well, in this time we're going to look at money itself. And I've got quantity of money on the horizontal. I've got, instead of price, you notice I have something a little different. It's called the purchasing power of money. That's what PPM stands for. This is the purchasing power, or the unit value of money in terms of what you can buy with it. And let's add in a familiar downward sloping demand for money curve and a familiar upward sloping supply or marginal cost curve. And what we see is that the equilibrium, quantity, and purchasing power of money, as we're familiar with by now, is determined at the intersection of demand and supply. What's happening with inflation? Well, it's simply this. We're going to see a decline in purchasing power. What's causing it? It's a monetary phenomenon. It's happening to the money itself, to the money supply itself. And it's quite simply this. The money supply is going to grow, and the money supply eclipses the demand. Now, as the supply grows, the demand can grow as well. So we could actually envision the demand curve shifting out a little bit like this. I'll label that demand 2. But you notice here supply 2 has shifted even more. So what's going to happen? Well, the new equilibrium unit value of money is going to be down at this lower level. Money losing value over time, that's inflation. Okay, you can see there's the lower purchasing power. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward to apply our basic supply and demand concept to understand inflation is a monetary phenomenon. It means the supply of money is growing faster than the demand for money, and hence money is losing value. Here's a pretty telling chart. Now we have one of the price index, price level measurements that we're going to use that we'll become very familiar with here. And this is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. What this does is allow us to track inflation over time. And take a look here. The concept is that what is the price for a particular basket of goods? Okay. And this literally takes a fixed basket of all different kinds of goods and says what do they cost in time period 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Okay. When you look back here, we're basically looking at 100 years worth of the price index. So what this says is that a basket of goods that had a cost of $10 in 1915 had a cost of $36 in 1965, had a cost of $100 in, this would be actually 1982, and more recently has a cost of $207. So we can see again the price of goods is going up. How much does it go up? Put that in percentage terms. That tells us how much the value of the dollar is going down. Now, this is going to be basically the same chart, but I'm going back over a much longer span of history. I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the U.S. Here we are right here in the 1770s, the American Revolution. And I want to point out to you the long-term trends of inflation. A couple of things that stand out at us when we look at the long-term trend of the price level in the U.S. Go back to the beginning, go back to the 1700s and 1800s. You'll notice that while there were little episodes of inflation here, here's an episode of inflation during the Revolutionary War. It didn't last, and the prices eventually come back down. Here's an episode of inflation during the War of 1812, but it didn't last, and the prices come back down. Here's an episode of inflation in the 1860s. What's going on there? If you've been watching the History Channel at all, you'll know that's the Civil War. But look, it comes back down. The prices go up quite a bit, but then they come back down for a long period in the late 1800s. And they're stable over the long run. The price level goes up and down, but it always comes back down, and it's very, very stable way up until the early 1900s. Now, after about 1913, 1914 or so, we're going to see inflation. Here's World War I. It comes back down a little bit. Then it comes down quite a bit more in the Great Depression. But it never quite gets back down to that old level of where it was. Instead, it starts creeping up and up and up and up and up and up. And then there's kind of a turning point here in the early 1970s to where the price level is on a pretty much one direction upward trajectory. And if you're anything like me, you're not a big fan of One Direction.
And we danced all night to the best song ever. We knew every line, now I can't remember. I think I went
Look at the historical episodes of inflation in U.S. history where the price level is going up. 1770s, 18 teens, 1860s, 19 teens. You can also see a little bit of it here in the 1940s. What geopolitical events do we have in common here? That's right, war. One common historical pattern you'll see is that inflation tends to happen during war. And the final aspect of this, there's a lot of interesting monetary history between the formation of the Federal Reserve here in 1914 and the final abandonment of the gold standard in 1971. But basically what brings us to what we have now, which is a pure paper money. The Federal Reserve note has no connection to the previous precious metals, gold or silver, which had defined the U.S. monetary standard all the way back from the very beginning, in fact going all the way back to colonial times, and before that going all the way back to medieval times. Okay. For this whole period here, the U.S. is on an ancient, some kind of gold and or silver monetary system. Since then, we're on a pure paper money system. If you look closely at your dollar bill, you'll just see it says legal tender for all debts. There is no reference, there is no connection to gold or silver. Go back to our supply and demand for money model, and it's pretty easy to think through what's happening here. Ask yourself, what's easier to increase the supply of? Okay, gold or paper? Okay. The supply of gold can increase with something, and I'll actually mention this again, something like a gold rush. We've seen several gold rushes in U.S. history alone. The supply of gold can increase quite a bit. The costs of it are reduced because they find a lot more of it. People flock to them thar hills, so to speak, to go dig up more gold, and the supply goes up a little bit, and the demand usually would go up a little bit each year as well, so the demand curve goes something like this. Supply goes up more than demand, and what you wind up with here, let me draw these lines in, that's our initial purchasing power. What you wind up here is the purchasing power goes down a little bit year by year. It's possible in a gold standard, definitely. It's also very possible that the supply doesn't go up very much at all, and eventually the demand comes to outpace the supply. And what happens is that you have a little bit of deflation. You actually have the purchasing power of money going up here. Okay, so you have PPM. Let's label that 2, PPM 1. With your gold rush, you have a little bit of inflation. With the end of the gold rush and the growth of the economy, money demand grows faster than supply, and you actually have a little bit of deflation. Okay, that's a gold standard. Well, think about now what happens to the cost of producing new money when we switch to paper money system. The cost of paper is really cheap, and it doesn't really even technically slope up. Just the cost, remember, supply is marginal cost. The marginal cost of adding paper money is essentially zero, or it's essentially very low. So what that means is the purchasing power of money can fall tremendously when you switch from a gold to a paper money system. Okay, now we want to talk about the problems of inflation. We have a good understanding of what inflation is and what's driving it. Now, what's the effect of inflation on the economy? What we want to realize is when inflation happens because money comes into the economy at specific places at specific times, and it actually doesn't cause the price of all goods to rise at the same time. It will eventually cause all goods to go up in price, but initially it's going to cause certain goods to go up in certain locations. And a good way to think about this is, again, go back in history and think about when the U.S. is actually on a gold standard. How does new money come into the economy? Well, it happens in a gold rush. Of course, we're talking about here the California gold rush, the 49ers, not those 49ers, but these 49ers. So this is the source of inflation when the U.S. economy is on a gold standard. Starts near the gold mines, gradually spreads to the rest of the economy. As I mentioned here, you take a look at the classic example from U.S. history with the California gold rush in the 1850s. What you saw is prices in the gold fields shot up first. San Francisco would be the main supply hub for the gold mining region out on the West Coast. And you saw prices of all kinds of goods, food items, clothing, especially mining capital, mining tools, picks and shovels, would be something like 2 to 3 times what they were on the East Coast. And this actually was the genesis of the clipper ship. It took a long time. It took months. It took basically all summer to go overland from St. Louis or Kansas City with a wagon load of goods to California. Well, a clipper ship could do it in maybe 80 or 90 days. Okay, the clipper ships, you'll see, they were nothing but sail and a relatively small cargo, and their goal was to get these goods they could buy for very cheap on the East Coast and get them to the West Coast and the gold miners as fast as they possibly could. Now, of course, we're on a paper money system now, so individual citizens can't go and literally produce money like they could back in the gold standard days, but the same kind of effect will happen in that new money enters the economy at specific locations, specific points in time. Now, though, it's the government issuing all the money. It's technically the government central bank, the Federal Reserve. The same phenomenon is in place. The new money is going to enter the economy in particular points in time, and it's going to cause a ripple effect of inflation. If you take a look, though, historically at the first kinds of paper money that were used in the United States, they were actually government-issued, treasury-type currency. And you saw the exact same kind of pattern as with the gold standard. The inflation is going to start in those industries where the government's spending the money on, and then eventually spreads out to the rest of the economy. Classic example here is the wartime inflation in the 1860s. Although eventually the price of all goods in general, the price index, and remember you can look back at the CPI numbers, that's basically going to double during the war years. It's going to affect certain goods before others, and oftentimes labor will be the last good affected. Okay, war materials will go up in price very fast, so things like gunpowder will rise in price very fast. Wages of an average worker, they actually are going to go down in real terms. They rise, but they don't rise as much as inflation, which means in real terms they go down. We can see here that some people are going to be worse off because of the inflation, and this we're going to get into talking about the problems. In fact, inflation is called a tax for this reason, because the government can gain purchasing power for itself by issuing new money, and the common citizens are frequently going to suffer because of this. Okay, and this brings us to our first major type of effect of inflation that we're going to look at, which is a redistribution of wealth effect. And there's two aspects to this. The first one is what I identify as the early late recipient effect. Put quite simply, inflation transfers real income or purchasing power from the late recipients of new money to the early recipients. Why? Well, quite simply, early recipient to spend money before the prices go up. Remember, you have to spend that new money to make the prices go up. Early recipients get to spend it first, prices then go up. People who receive the money last see the prices go up before they get their hands on the new money.
And again, note here, the inflation tax is at play because government in a paper money system is by definition the first recipient. Government is issuing the money. Government can spend, can acquire more goods. And if you think about how many goods are available in the economy at a given point in time, well, it's relatively fixed. Okay, the quantity of goods can't grow very fast. So if the government's getting more goods for whatever purposes, for fighting a war or what have you, that means the citizens are left with fewer goods. Okay? Inflation is a tax. It's not called a tax. It's not labeled as a tax. The government will often try to downplay its effect, but it's clearly a tax nonetheless.
And an example I like to tell in class about this is what I call a Kegs and Keys effect. And I'm thinking about when the United States during the Civil War was printing money to pay for the war effort, the introduction of the first greenbacks. Some people got wealthy because of this, and some people really suffered because of this. So we have a classic example of these early late recipient effects. Early recipients would be people who supplied war material to the government. So the gunpowder companies, they got this money. They got the new money first before prices of goods in general rose, and as prices were rising, they were getting fresh supplies of new money at higher prices. So they could kind of stay ahead of the inflation, so to speak, and they saw the price of their output rising before, or at least along with, the prices of their inputs, so their profit margins could stay steady, and of course business was booming for them during the war. On the other hand, think about piano companies. Now, to begin with, the war is going to drive down demand for luxury goods such as pianos. People are suffering. People are seeing their lives and property destroyed. They just don't have the wherewithal to consume luxury goods at the rate they used to. But more than that, piano makers are going to see their cost of production rise, because what are their inputs? There's lumber and the steel for the wires, and then the labor of skilled craftsmen. Well, all those things have both been diverted by the government to go into war material. The government's, requisitioning lumber to make wagons and steel to make guns, and laborers, are being drafted into the military. So they're in shorter supply to begin with, and inflation is driving their price up to boot. So the piano makers are seeing less demand, therefore lower prices that people are willing to pay for the product, and higher costs, partly due to the diversion of resources because of the war effort, partly due to the inflation. So piano makers see the price of their product come down and the cost of their inputs go up. And it might be to the extent that they can't make money selling pianos. While I haven't done extensive research on this, my guess is that piano makers did very poorly during the Civil War years.
Okay, a second effect, which will again be a redistribution of wealth effect that we'll see with inflation, is known as the debtor-creditor effect. Debtors, of course, that's just a fancy term for people who borrow money, and creditors for people who lend money. And what we're going to see with inflation, especially when it's unexpected, okay, when people don't see it coming, is that it's going to reduce real interest rates on loans. If you're borrowing, you want to see lower interest rates, so that's going to help you as a borrower. And it's also going to reduce the real value of your principal. So we're going to see that borrowers benefit from this. They see the real value of their debt decreased. In other words, they can repay their debt, which is a fixed quantity of money, with the same quantity of money, remember, is worth much less when inflation occurs. So debtors can repay with depreciated money that's easier to get their hands on. Okay. Lenders, on the other hand, are going to lose out. They're going to see their real return on their investments reduced by the inflation, and it can even become negative. Okay. So lenders can actually see a reduction, even though they're going to get paid nominally in more dollars. Every dollar is worth proportionately less than what they were planning on, so they're actually losing out.
Okay, now let me give you an example of how this plays out. This is a bit of an extreme example, but it's helpful sometimes to think in extremes because it spells out exactly what's going on a smaller scale with inflation. So let's say you borrow $10,000 in the year 2014 to buy equipment for your business. And I'll say it's a lawn mowing business, so you borrow $10,000 and that enables you to buy a good used little pickup truck and riding lawnmower with a trailer, so you can drive around. You have all the basic equipment you need to do a lawn mowing business. In 2015, the price index rises from 100 to 1,000. Now, we've never experienced inflation this severe in the United States, and I think we never will, even if we have a major fiscal crisis. Even in the Civil War, we didn't experience this, but just to show you kind of an extreme effect. This amounts to a 900% inflation rate. You calculate a percent change, of course, by subtracting the first observation from the second observation and dividing that by the first observation, and then we multiply by 100. So we've got 900%, you can follow that simple arithmetic there. 900% inflation, unexpected inflation, so it's not going to be priced into interest rates. And what that means is $1,015 is equivalent in purchasing power to just 100 of the old dollars, the original 2014 dollars. So I borrowed 10,000 of these older, more valuable dollars, and I can repay that with a tenth of that in terms of the new dollars, because new dollars represent old dollars at this 10-to-1 ratio. So if I sold off $1,000 worth of assets at the old price level, I could pay off my loan, and I've therefore stolen $9,000 worth of goods from the bank. Well, it's not really theft, but in effect it is, because the bank is facing this loss. So here's an example. I found a lawn company equipment for sale on Craigslist, but let's say you could buy this little pickup truck, trailer, and that nice little riding mower there for $10,000. That's basically all you need to start a lawn mowing business. You maybe need a little bit more equipment, and you could sell that off. Here's another real Craigslist ad for a kind of junky used car that's worth about $1,000. So you basically can acquire this nice set of assets here, which is worth $10,000 plus, with this junky little asset here, which is worth basically $1,000, if we get this extreme unexpected inflation. Now, in reality, do we sometimes get unexpected inflation? Yeah, maybe 8, 10, 12%, not 900%. So you can't steal $10,000 from a bank in 1 year, but you might be able to steal a few hundred or a few $1,000s, depending on the amount that you borrow. Now, banks and creditors in general, money lenders in general, aren't going to be dumb about this. They're not going to let people steal this from them. So if they see inflation coming, or if they sense inflation's coming, they're going to go ahead and factor the inflation rate into the interest rate to give them protection from the withering effect of inflation on their real interest earnings. And that leads us to the Fisher equation. And we can think of it in two ways. We can think about you take an underlying real interest rate and you add the inflation rate onto that to arrive at the nominal interest rate. Okay, nominal interest rate would be the interest rate you pay for a loan, the terms of the contract, and that includes two components, inflation and the real interest rate. Another way to think about this is that the real rate, the actual earnings in terms of real resources that a creditor earns, is the nominal rate minus the inflation rate.
You can really see this Fisher effect at work if you look back at the inflation rate and various interest rates going back over U.S. history. So what I have is the bank prime loan rate. That's the blue line. And this is basically the interest rate that well-established businesses can borrow at, and businesses often will. Even large businesses will go and from time to time they prefer to borrow money rather than liquidate assets or something along those lines. So this is currently, you can see right here, it's currently at about 3%. Notice our inflation rate has been pretty low. In fact, our inflation rate goes negative in 2009. It did spike up briefly to about 4%, but now it's back, inflation rate's back about 2%. So what's our real prime interest rate right now? It's 1%. 1% real interest rate for prime bank loans. Again, these are short-term loans. These are going to be typically like a 30-day type loan. A business that just needs some cash, some temporary financing, can come in and borrow this kind of money from a bank. But notice when inflation was higher, okay, and inflation, again, is the red line. When inflation was high, like here it was high in 1980, we had that 14% annual inflation rate in this inflationary period of the 1970s. You can see where the inflation rate, starting in right around 1970 here, the inflation rate starts to go up. This is where we get into that printing too much money mode. Inflation rate goes up and it peaks about 14%. Look what happens to these short-term interest rates. They go up and they hit 20%. Okay, short-term interest rates at 20%. Inflation's at 14. Once again, real interest rate's the difference. We have a 6% real short-term interest rate back in 1980. And let me ask you something. Do you think that's a high interest rate? You better believe it. Okay. Again, the 20%, that seems sky high, but 14% of that's an inflation premium. So what we want to focus on is that real interest rate adjusting for inflation. Well, rates are low now. That's 1%. Rates are very low because the Federal Reserve is trying to stimulate the economy. But rates were very high back then. 6% on prime bank credit is a very high interest rate. Okay. You go back to a stable period in the 1950s and 60s, you see there was a few up and downs here, but go back and look at this pretty stable time in the economy and the rate was about as low as it is now. Okay, so it definitely has its ups and downs, but what's going to be driving it up more than anything, and let me clean this off, you'll notice what's going to be driving it up more than anything, look at the tight fit with inflation. When inflation goes up, the prime rate goes up. When inflation comes back down, the prime rate comes back down, and these two series move in lockstep. And I could show you any interest rate series, and you'll see when inflation comes down, that's the red line. The interest rate comes down, that's the blue line. Okay, so inflation rates do drive interest rates, because inflation, remember, is reducing the purchasing power of your money. You've got to compensate for that. When you're trying to earn an interest return, you've got to add the inflation rate back in, and that is what this Fisher effect is all about. Okay, Fisher effect, again, is the inflation premium on interest rates.